In this season, we strive to bring you stories that decenter history.
History resonates differently with different people. Through sharing these personal stories, both from our guests and the people they talk about,
we want to challenge the dominant narratives that focus on single strands and one-dimensional stories.
Join us for Season 2 of Who This Podcast.
Season 2 is here to redefine the way we understand our past.
Because the past really happened, and history is just what somebody wrote down.
Hi, this is Rami, and today we're not going to be talking about Rumi. What you seek is seeking you. That is Rumi, one of the most famous poets of the last millennium. Rumi, the mystic, founding father of what we know today as the Sufi order, has a lot of influence on modern day culture. Rumi wrote about love, he also sought love. However, a lot of people don't know or even unfamiliar with one of the most influential people in Rumi's life, and potentially one of the reasons why we have Rumi's art today. Our story takes us back to the late 1100s in Tabriz of Persia, modern day Iran, which was at that moment under the Mongolian influence. This is where our Shams grew up. Shams al-Din grew up in a house of a very generous father. He did not really have what we can call a very delicate childhood. From day dot, he felt a bit misunderstood. And that was something that we can see through all of his writings as well. As he grew older, it crystallized to him and his father that he's not going to have a very typical, a very typical life ahead of him. And this is what kind of pushed him to venture into the world. And I think this upbringing, this start of an early life in that context kind of created the character who he came to be afterwards. But I just want to stop here for a second and ask, what kind of things do you kind of know about Shams or Rumi, his companion? Just in one sentence, what kind of things do you know about either of them?
What I know of Shams and Rumi is that they come from the school of thought of Sufism, which is an Islamic mysticism, that they are very poetic and that a lot of what they focus on is love and light, and that is the path to being as close to the divine as possible.
Yeah, what I know about them is that something in their meeting, something mystical happened that changed both of their lives. There's actually 3 different stories that I heard about how they met, but in each story, there was something otherworldly that happened that caused Rumi to be deeply attracted to this man, this man and his way of being and his idea. That something happened that wasn't humanly possible, at least according to the experience that Rumi had with this man, that caused him then to change his life and focus on this man's teaching.
And I think I know quite little in terms of poetry in general, and specifically it's difficult for me to understand the spiritual side of things. So in what ways they influenced the whole populations to come, and how their words transcended across religions and across cultures. I know that that's the case, but I'm very interested in knowing more about that.
Yeah, no, I think these are all very relevant parts of their lives, more onto Shams, because his life was kind of building up to that moment of meeting with Rumi. But also the space where he found himself, which is again Sufism, as Charlotte mentioned. So Sufism is this belief indeed that everything comes from the divine, from a god at some point, and that everything that we do is out of love from that perspective. And it is in that school of thought that Shams found himself. And this is where he ventured onto his journey to learn more about God, about the world, about the divine, about love also. And through all of his journeys with different, what he would call masters he came across, he would always find it frustrating that he can experience things, that he can have all of these intense emotions and thoughts, but never have the words to be able to express them. To the point where one of his masters once prayed for him that God would bestow upon him a man, a companion, who can speak on his behalf and who can be his tongue. And now that we are seeing the story after it has completed, we could see that maybe that prayer was answered eventually when he first met Rumi in Konya around 1244 AD. And yeah, as Dave was mentioning, that there were many theories, stories about how they met. Which one appeals to you most, or which one do you think is more plausible?
Wow, plausibility. When it comes to things like mysticism, plausibility kind of goes through the door, because what I think is the one that best connected to me experientially is when Shams asks Rumi the difference between Muhammad and some other mystic.
Mm-hmm.
And Shams said he was already with God and more connected to God, while Muhammad was saying he would still have space and needed to know more about God. And then Rumi kind of talked to him and showed him that actually the man who was filled was because he didn't have much capacity. So he was filled easily. But Muhammad had so much capacity that no matter how much he was filled, he had space to be filled more. And that's why Muhammad kept going. And then in the midst of that conversation, something opened up in Rumi. And Rumi, I don't know, they say like his head opened or something. But whatever happened, some divine light entered Rumi in that conversation. And something happened to Shams that Shams said, this is the man I've been looking for. This is the man that I've been seeking for all my life.
And that's a very good story to choose to tell, because it also gives a bit of an explanation on the difference between the two men at the time. So Rumi at that moment was a very esteemed clerk in Konya. He was the one guiding the religious authorities of the kingdom at the moment. He was also the place where people sought guidance and wisdom from. And then Shams was the person who was just roaming around looking for the next person who he could learn from. And then when they met, both of them, they were at a very different moment in each of their lives. Again, where Rumi was this influential person from a space of power, while Shams was coming from, well, basically being a dervish, which is partially doing the bare minimum to survive and focusing on content of life rather than its pleasures.
So how did he get through life then?
Both of them.
Because now Shams, you're saying was more of an outcast, right? So how did he survive if he wasn't that rich?
Yeah. So basically, part of the experience of a Sufi person was living in Sufi houses growing up. And this is basically the place where he serves masters. And then in exchange, he would get accommodation and food. And that is a choice that people at the time opted to have. It's not something that he had to do, but this is where he found himself. And as he moved from city to city, before he would find a place, he would just engage in very basic needs for society at that moment. I think part of it was just like helping with some agriculture, helping with some farming, only just to be able to afford a living, basically just to eat the bare minimum. And then he moves on to the next stop and so ever. So his main concern was finding people who he can learn from, people who can challenge his thought, but also as he grew older, people who he can transfer his knowledge to, people who he can speak his mind with without necessarily feeling the same misunderstanding that he had with his father and his community growing up. So yeah, this is basically how he made the ends meet. And building on again to the meeting point, where after they met briefly, Rumi had invited Shams to stay at his place for as long as he needed. And that was surprisingly the beginning of the end of Shams's life at that point, because this is also where we know now that from that moment it was the beginning of a great world of emotions and poetry and art coming out from Rumi. But also this is where Shams would find his last place of stay. And yeah, and I just wanted to stop here because I know that there is a lot of speculation about the relationship that they had both. And I think this is something that we were discussing right before we were preparing this episode.
Yeah, if you read some of the poetry, I think you can question whether there was more than just a mentor-pupil relationship going on. Like at some point they stayed in a room together for 40 days straight without leaving that room. I mean, I don't know. Of course, it's wild speculation that there was a romantic relationship ongoing, and I think it might be a westernized idea as well that there always has to be some sort of romantic relationship in a spiritual companionship, the way they described it. But it is interesting. If you especially see some of the poetry that Rumi wrote when Shams left, it seems like he was really
grieving.
Yeah. And is that grievance like because he lost a romantic partner or no?
I wonder, because I've read that when they initially met, they became inseparable, and that together they formed a kind of mystical communion. And I'm questioning whether we have the language today to understand that mystical communion in any other way than romantic love. For me, I don't see dominant narratives of any other forms of love. And also what, we're indoctrinated to aspire towards. That's the dominant framework of relationships. So yeah, I'm not sure if it's also just a want of imagination, not talking about responsibility, but just that's the framework that we're using to, try to understand almost 1,000 years ago, their relationship.
Yeah. And I'm going to do something that I really don't like doing, because when we're talking about people in their context, I like to kind of keep the conversation within that context. But there is something that helps me personally to understand something like this. Because you did have the desert monks who lived in cloisters together and were together for years and never left the monastery. And some of them lived in the same cell, were bunk in the same cell, a very small room together for meditation purposes. And they only leave for the necessities, and then they went back into their cell. And that idea, and that's a Western thing, right? And the idea that, well, it can exist in that area, that nobody talks about them being, of any sexual relationship, but really a spiritual one. But when it happens between these two men, it had to have been something sexual. It doesn't translate to me. No, it could be. And I'm not dismissing the idea that it could be. I'm just saying that, like, to just jump on it and say, well, the only way to explain this thing is this. And then you lost somebody who was a mystical companion to you. And of course you're going to feel that. I had mystical companions who died, and I felt that very deeply. And for half a year, it took me to kind of like get over that loss, because I wouldn't have the wisdom of that person again. And I wasn't even as close to them as Rumi was to Shams. And so I just feel like you said something earlier, that the idea of a lover is broad. And one thing injected in it don't make it higher or lower than the other. It's just that a lover is a lover, and a connection is a connection deeply wherever it stands.
Yeah, no, I definitely see your point. I think also the source of some of those speculations is because of the changes that went around in each of their lives after they have met. So if you read what was said at the time about the relationship, and also some of the controversies that happened at the moment, was that people used the word jealous a lot when they wanted to describe their relationship with Shams. So in the same household of where Shams was living, also Rumi's partner and kids were living. And lots of text talks about jealousy, that, for example, a son was feeling around Shams because of how much his father was spending time with him. Also, Rumi's partner, wife, she was also expressing a bit of jealousy and discontent with how much she was spending time with him. And the general members of society, who were seeing that their clerk, who would always be in esteemed spaces, always talking from the grandest mosque at the moment, being seen with him going into inns to challenge some of those social norms that were popular at the time. So it's not as much as the time that they spent together, but how much they have influenced each other's lives. And that made people wonder, can this type of influence or change on one's life come from someone who is only through a mentor sort of relationship? And yeah, like this idea of who a lover is, because the story of Shams and Rumi are being used to describe changes in society, are being used to talk about politics and religion, but also they're being used to talk about love. And the idea that both of them were lovers, as they also were mentor and mentee, as they also were a member of society from the marginalized groups and a very powerful sheikh or mullah, there are so many ways you can look at their relationship. And I think in the version where they were lovers, this is where this whole idea on sexuality comes into place. But also let's remember that at that moment, sexuality was not as pronounced as it is today. It was not something that people used to necessarily talk about. It's something that was just there at the background of everyday life. And so I think it's a modern take on their relationship, whether it was sexual or not. But I think at that moment, when people used the word jealousy, when people were talking about how much Rumi is being influenced by Shams, I don't think they cared if they were sleeping together or not, but rather that their presence was kind of threatening to the general public at that time, whether it was personal relationships or also just societal ideas of how religious clerks should behave.
What did that jealousy do?
Well, not very nice things at the end. So I think Shams was towards the end of a 2-year period that he was staying with Rumi, where they were staying in the same place. They also wrote about the 40 rules of love, which both of them see as sort of like a manifesto of understanding the divine and our place in the world, which is a very nice compilation of ideas and thoughts that actually really can help us today also navigate the challenges of life. But yeah, going back to the jealousy part, I think towards the end of a 2-year period together, Shams was feeling the increased scrutiny from society and he decided to leave unannounced. He went to Syria, where I think it was Aleppo, where he stayed for some time. Rumi could not take it. He sent for his son to bring Shams back. And then again, Shams came back again, but that time was different. Something has changed a bit in their dynamic. And also people were a bit more eager for Shams to leave now that they knew that it was a possibility for him to leave Rumi alone and for things to go back again to how they looked like before. And then eventually, we don't know exactly what happened, but we know that on one night, Shams completely disappeared from Konya. There were many theories about what happened. Some of them claim that he was killed on the spot on the same day that he disappeared. Some others say that he roamed around also to find the same fate at the end and being killed. He was eventually found in a well. And when this news hit Rumi, a flood of grief and emotions were released from Rumi that we can trace today in modern poetry in poetry that he wrote, but also in modern day influences on some of the things that he talked about.
What I wanted to say is thanks for bringing in like the comparison between a modern take on, the sexual aspect of their relationship. For me, it's like they were lovers regardless of whether they had sex or not. And our obsession with sex is a reflection of the role and power it plays today. So yeah, I really like that you expanded beyond. But of course, it's also important that, we do talk about the possibility that there was a sexual relationship, because how many figures in history do we learn about that are queer, So that's also important.
Yeah. No, it's a very good point.
I wanted to ask Rami, what do you think then the influence of Shams was on Rumi's work and on the themes that he was writing about?
So one of the things that many people can attribute to Shams's influence is the expansion of Rumi's poetry after Shams left, actually, or disappeared from his life. So if you look at the poems from Rumi, they seemed a bit orthogonal in that sense before Shams appeared in his life. So they were a bit structured, they were a bit rigid in that sense. But then after Shams disappeared, I think it started with his grievance over Shams, that then he kind of like unlocked a flow of emotions, a flow of expressions that came as a direct effect of his shock, but also about the time that they spent together. Let's not forget that they wrote about love together. They talked about love. And when you lose someone like that, it kind of like leaves a scar in your heart. And sometimes this scar bleeds tears, but also sometimes bleeds love. And I think if we look at one of the things that Shams said to Rumi before he left, we can understand the extent of how much Rumi felt seen, by Shams as well. So one of the things that Shams, this is one of the things that stand out in the conversations that they had together, was that Shams told Rumi once, anyone can choose you in your glow, but I will choose you even when it dims. Make sure that I, even if I see light in others, will choose your darkness. And that speaks of a very strong bond, regardless of how we can reflect on the relationship together, that makes it essential to each other's existence in that sense. And yeah, again, if you lose someone like that, even if it's not love that you were talking about, it will invoke emotions in you. It will push you to reflect on things differently, on your space in the world differently. And I think this is what we can see through Rumi's poems after Shams disappeared. And we also have a distinction between the feelings that Rumi had felt when Shams disappeared and when he learned about his death. So one of the things that Rumi mentioned or wrote when he did not find Shams anymore, he said, "Where did the handsome beloved go? I wonder, where did that tall, shapely cypress tree go? He spread his light among us like a candle. Where did he go? So strange, where did he go without me?" And that also gives us an indication of this sense of shock.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I think it also says a lot. And to me, I mean, I don't want to. I think I'm reflecting what Charlotte's also saying. Like, I don't necessarily want to label it as a romantic relationship as we know it today. But I mean, there was a very deep love amongst the two people. Like, you can't deny it. If you read this, there was much going on, and we don't have to. I think we don't have to reflect it the way we see it today. There was just a genuine love connection between the two people, and it sounds like a beautiful thing they had.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily deny that it was romantic, because I think that was their relationship is a reference of what romanticism can be, or rather should be, because it should not be tied to the gender of the person or the type of formal contract they have in society, but rather the type of influence they have on each other and how much space they occupy in each other's existence. And yeah, I think that should be a reference to how relationships and loving relationships look like, rather than just sticking to the traditional figures that we all grew up with.
Right. Bringing it back to what you said earlier about, what it means to be a lover, right? It's like, it doesn't mean one is higher or lower because of genitalia, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's about the connection. And the thing is, I like to read about female mystics and some of the stuff that they spoke about, which is, they say was subversive, but the way they spoke about the relationship to the divine and the relationship to connection was deeply orgasmic. Right? And nobody would say they were having a sexual relationship with God, genitalia to genitalia. But it was a romantic relationship, as you were pointing out, and a deep soul-to-soul relationship.
Yeah.
That should define what is a deep, loving, romantic relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a very good intake on how we reflect on their lives today. There's also another part of their lives that we seem to misread sometimes, which is, what do we make of our differences in society? This is an example of a story of two people who are coming from very different backgrounds with very different schools of thought, who find refuge in one another from the rest of society. And I think that's also a focus that we need in today's world. So it's not only about the reference to love that they had for each other, but also, what do we make of strangers? How do we start a conversation with strangers? How do we find spaces where we can connect rather than disconnect? Because I can imagine, any of us could imagine that with two people like both of them, if they had started off on a very different path of introductions, they wouldn't have delved into each other that deeply. They could have easily identified the differences in each of them, the ego that comes with wanting to prove yourself righteous in that sense, did not really appear in the relationship. I think this is one of the things that made them come together, that both of them were humbled by their place in the world to the point where they just saw the human in each other rather than the ego in themselves. And that helped them connect and produced one of the very famous relationships that we know about in recent history. And yeah, I wonder if you have any intakes on how their story is relevant today with today's polarization and with today's conflicting opinions that kind of tend to divide people to the point where they only kind of like allude to people who have the same school of thought rather than try to challenge themselves with meeting people outside of that sphere. How do you reflect on this comparison between the relationship they had and today's needs?
Yeah, well, if they were ever a representation of opposite attracts,
yeah,
right, it's those two. But I think we live in a society now that's filled with echo chambers, and we have all the different various platforms that makes it so easy for you to find that. And everyone is trying to find their tribe. And once you find your tribe, you kind of try to stick with it, right? Like you try to, because everyone wants acceptance. But a lot of people don't want growth because growth hurts. And if you look at the meeting between these two, it was kind of this thing that hurt Rumi in the beginning, it seemed, but then it became something that caused him to be a better version of himself. And I feel like if we only but can endure a little bit of hurt in our expansion and growth and step outside of our different echo chambers, they're okay to feel accepted, but sometimes they keep us stunted in growth. And if we follow Rumi and follow Shams and try to find what our true purpose is, you'll be surprised, because what they were looking for was purpose, and that's how they found each other. Especially Shams looking for his purpose and found out that, oh, Rumi is my purpose. Like, this is the guy I've been looking for. You're not going to find it in your space. Sometimes your purpose is bigger than you and bigger than your echo chambers. And you just need to step outside of that and find it in the person that you would never really talk to.
I like that reflection on their story.
Yeah, what really resonated for me was what you said about them finding refuge in each other. Because what I've read about Shams and what you've shared is that he was an outcast, not understood by even his own father. He said he felt like a stranger in his own town. And he says to his father when he tells him, I don't know who you are, he says, after having tried the sea, I find it my home. And if you choose to stay on the shore, is it my fault? I am not to be blamed. And I feel like what he's saying there is that those people deemed as outsiders to the norm are people who expand beyond the boundaries and boxes that are available. And that's a very lonely journey. And indeed, I feel like we are all looking for our tribe, but I don't know if this message of, going beyond division, one of their 40 rules of love says, you can study God through everything and everyone in the universe because God is not confined to a mosque, a synagogue, or a church. But that's not the message that I've received growing up in one of those religions. And yeah, I find their story really powerful. And I'm curious what drew you to talk about Shams today, if you want to share.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So I think I mentioned at the beginning that he was one of the most influential characters I grew up with. And I think it was around my early adolescence that I was introduced to him. And at that moment, I was experiencing my sexuality. I was experiencing my homosexuality, and I was trying to come in terms with it. And the kind of binary I grew up in was that you can either be a religious Muslim, because that was the house that I grew up in, or that you can be a gay Westerner. And I couldn't find myself in that divide, because my religion was very dear to me, to find myself estranged to it. At the same time, there was liberty on the other side of how I can explore myself and accept myself. And it was actually in the relationship between Rumi and Shams where I find that there was a bit of freedom in that. It was something that did not necessarily fit the binary narrative that I was fed. And I found myself in their relationship. I found myself sort of present as I read about the conversations they had with one another. And I could see myself writing those things to someone I would meet in the future without necessarily having it tied to a sexual experience, because at that moment I was not really accepting that part of me yet. But I was very appreciative of the love that they had for each other, and I longed and I yearned for a similar experience that I would be lucky to experience in my life if that was the case. That story opened up space for me in the world, a world that did not necessarily provide me with space to be myself. I found myself in a story that happened 1,000 years ago, and the characters there were relevant to me more than the characters of modern day and time. So it kind of like shattered this idea that I have to stick with the definitions that we are growing up today, and that we can just really look beyond love as a concept, as an idea, rather than how it represents itself and how it manifests itself in today's world. And that eventually led to me accepting who I am and getting in terms with my sexuality, but also seeing people differently. And I could imagine very easily that had I not been introduced to that story, I would have been very much an extremist on either side of the binary that I grew up with. And I'm very lucky to not find myself on either of the extremes of that spectrum, because it allowed me to connect with people who are various, who are diverse, who are complex along those binaries that I was told I had to fit in. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
So powerful.
That's deep.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. Share this episode with your Shams and find us wherever you listen to your podcasts.